June 1, 2009, just after midnight over the Atlantic Ocean. Air France Flight 447 is flying through complete darkness. The sky ahead is invisible. The ocean below cannot be seen. And inside the cockpit, something suddenly changes. The autopilot disconnects without warning. Alarms erupt across the flight deck. And within seconds, the aircraft begins to behave in a way the crew does not understand. What exactly just failed? For those watching right now, this is one of those stories that seems impossible until you follow every second of it. If you are here, tell me where you are watching from. Because this flight connected continents, but what happened next shocked the entire world. And if you want more real aviation investigations, hit like and make sure to subscribe, because this story only gets deeper from here. To understand what really happened, we have to go back to May 31, 2009, in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Air France Flight 447 is preparing for a long overnight journey across the Atlantic to Paris. The departure is scheduled for the evening local time, which means the entire flight will take place through the night. Why does that matter? Because flying at night changes everything for the human body. The flight is expected to last nearly 13 hours, which means the pilots will be operating during the most dangerous biological window known as circadian low. This is the time when alertness drops and reaction speed slows. So how do airlines deal with this risk? They add an extra pilot. On this flight, there are 3 pilots, a captain with over 11,000 hours of experience, 2 first officers, one of them relatively young with around 3,000 hours, and another more experienced first officer with thousands of hours on the aircraft. But here is the question: does experience always guarantee correct decisions under pressure? Before departure, the crew reviews their route. The weather at both ends of the journey looks fine, but the route itself hides a challenge. Ahead of them lies a region known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone. This is not just another weather system. This is one of the most dangerous atmospheric zones on Earth. In this region, winds from both hemispheres collide, forcing warm, moist air violently upward. This creates massive thunderstorm systems that can reach heights far above normal flight levels. But what makes them even more dangerous is that they are often difficult to detect on radar. Why would that be? Because these storms form over the ocean. Their structure can contain less dense water particles, making them appear weaker on radar than they really are. So an aircraft might think it is avoiding danger, when in reality, it is flying straight into it. And that raises another question. How prepared was this crew for what they were about to encounter? Inside these storms, another hidden threat exists: high-altitude ice crystals. Unlike heavy rain, these crystals do not stick to the aircraft surfaces. Instead, they travel in huge volumes and can enter sensitive sensors. What happens if those sensors fail? The aircraft relies on precise measurements of airflow to determine speed. Without accurate speed information, the aircraft systems cannot function correctly, and the device responsible for measuring this airflow is called the pitot probe, a small tube facing forward into the wind. It seems simple, but what if it gets blocked? There had already been multiple reports of pitot probes becoming blocked by ice crystals in similar conditions. These incidents had been documented and shared with pilots across the airline. But here is the key detail. The failures were considered temporary and manageable, so the upgrades to fix the issue were recommended but not required. Why was that decision made? Because the loss of speed readings was believed to last only a short time, and pilots were trained to handle it. But training is only effective if it matches the real situation, and this is where things begin to get complicated. The aircraft itself is an Airbus A330, relatively modern and equipped with advanced fly-by-wire systems. This means the aircraft is not directly controlled by mechanical inputs. Instead, computers interpret pilot commands and apply protections to keep the aircraft within safe limits. But what happens when the computers lose trust in their own data? If the system detects conflicting or unreliable information, it will gradually remove these protections. The aircraft shifts into a different control mode, where the pilots must manually manage everything, including preventing a stall. So the real question becomes, will the pilots recognize this shift in time? The aircraft is fully prepared, fuel is loaded, passengers board. 216 people take their seats, unaware of what lies ahead. The engines start, pushback begins. At 22:09 UTC, the aircraft taxis smoothly to the runway, and soon after it accelerates into the night sky. The takeoff is completely normal. The aircraft climbs away from Rio following its planned route along the Brazilian coastline. At around 20,000 feet, one of the first officers leaves the cockpit for scheduled rest, leaving the captain and the other first officer in control. Everything appears routine, but is it really? As the aircraft reaches cruising altitude, it transitions from radar-controlled airspace into the vast emptiness of the Atlantic. Here, tracking becomes limited, communication relies on long-range systems, and one important system fails to activate due to a simple formatting error. This means the aircraft will not be automatically tracked once it leaves radar coverage. Why does that matter? Because if something goes wrong, locating the aircraft becomes far more difficult, and at this moment nobody realizes how critical that detail will become later. Inside the cockpit, the flight continues normally. The aircraft cruises at 35,000 feet. The pilots monitor systems and communicate with air traffic control. The night outside is completely dark, and ahead of them, the storm system slowly grows closer. The pilots begin discussing the weather. They can see cloud formations building ahead. The question now is simple. Should they avoid it or fly through it? They consider climbing higher, but their performance limits prevent them from doing so safely, so they decide to continue at their current altitude. At this stage, everything still seems under control, but subtle signs are beginning to appear. The turbulence increases slightly, the clouds thicken, the environment outside becomes more unstable, and then something unusual appears. St. Elmo fire. Small electrical discharges dancing across the aircraft surfaces. This is not just a visual effect. It is a warning sign of strong electrical activity in the surrounding air, which means they are getting closer to severe weather. But despite this, the captain decides to leave the cockpit for rest. Now the two first officers are alone. One of them becomes the acting captain. The other monitors the flight. And here is the critical question. What happens when responsibility suddenly shifts in the middle of a developing situation? The two pilots discuss the weather ahead. They acknowledge the storm system, but they do not make a major deviation. Instead, they make a small adjustment to the left, only 12 degrees. Is that enough to avoid what lies ahead? Minutes pass. The aircraft enters the cloud layer. Visibility drops to 0. Outside, there is nothing but darkness. Inside the cockpit, the environment remains calm, but the tension is building. The pilots feel light turbulence. They adjust speed slightly to prepare for it. Everything still appears manageable, but then another subtle change occurs. The sound outside begins to change. At first, it sounds like rain. Then it becomes sharper, louder, more intense. The temperature inside the cockpit shifts slightly. The air feels different. One of the pilots notices a strange smell, ozone. This is not random. This is another sign that they are entering a highly active storm environment. But what exactly is happening to the aircraft sensors at this moment? The ice crystals now hitting the aircraft are not just impacting the exterior. They are entering the pitot probes, the very sensors responsible for measuring speed. And as they begin to clog those probes, the aircraft starts receiving conflicting data. Inside the cockpit, everything still appears normal for a brief moment. The autopilot is engaged. The systems are functioning. But beneath the surface, the data feeding those systems is beginning to fail. And then without warning at 02:10:05, everything changes. The autopilot disconnects. The autothrottle disconnects. Alarms sound simultaneously, and the aircraft suddenly begins to bank. The first officer reacts immediately. He grabs the controls and tries to stabilize the aircraft. But what he does next will determine everything that follows. Why did the autopilot disconnect? And what exactly are the pilots seeing on their instruments? Because at this exact moment, the aircraft has just lost something far more critical than autopilot control. It has lost reliable speed information, and the pilots do not yet understand it. The cockpit is no longer calm. The moment the autopilot disconnects, the entire aircraft changes character. The first officer is suddenly forced into manual control at high altitude, in darkness, inside a storm. At the same time, the instruments in front of him begin to lie. But the most dangerous part is this. He does not yet know that they are lying. The aircraft banks sharply to the right. A sudden gust pushes it off balance. The first officer reacts instinctively. He applies opposite input to level the wings, but something feels wrong. The controls feel more sensitive and less stable. Why is the aircraft behaving like this? Because in that exact moment, The flight control system has degraded from normal law into alternate law. The protections that once prevented dangerous attitudes are now gone. The aircraft will no longer stop itself from stalling. The pilots must now do everything manually. But were they fully aware of this transition? At the same time, the speed indications collapse. One display suddenly shows 60 knots. Another shows something completely different. The standby instrument also becomes unreliable. In an instant, the pilots lose the most critical parameter of flight, airspeed. But what does a pilot do when the speed disappears? The training says maintain known pitch and thrust settings. That requires immediate recognition of the problem. Inside this cockpit, recognition does not come fast enough. Instead, the first officer reacts to what he sees. The altitude indication suddenly drops. The vertical speed shows descent, even though the aircraft is not actually descending. This is caused by faulty pressure data being fed into the system, but to the pilot it looks real, so he pulls back on the controls to climb. This is the first critical mistake, and it happens within seconds. The aircraft begins to pitch upward. At first it is subtle. Then it increases rapidly. The climb rate jumps to nearly 7,000 feet per minute, far beyond normal limits. But why is the aircraft climbing so aggressively? Because at high altitude there is very little margin between safe speed and stall speed. This is known as the coffin corner. If the aircraft climbs too steeply, it loses speed very quickly. Without accurate speed information, the pilots cannot see it happening. Inside the cockpit, alarms begin stacking on top of each other. Multiple warning messages appear. 10 different alerts chime within seconds. Each one demands attention. Each one adds confusion. None of them clearly say what the real problem is. The relief pilot tries to read the warnings. His voice is rushed and unclear. The first officer struggles to interpret what is happening. He asks questions but receives incomplete answers. The coordination between them begins to break down. At the same time, the engines are still producing climb thrust. The auto throttle had disconnected, but the thrust levers were not adjusted correctly. Instead of stabilizing the situation, the aircraft continues to climb harder. With every second, it is losing more speed. A brief stall warning sounds. It is short and easy to miss. The relief pilot hears it, but questions what it means. Was that really a stall warning, or just another alarm in the chaos? This moment is critical, because if they had recognized the stall at this stage, the outcome might have been different, but the warning disappears quickly. The confusion continues. The aircraft now reaches an extreme pitch angle, 11 degrees nose up, then 12 degrees. The climb continues. The airspeed continues to drop. But the pilots cannot see it clearly. The first officer is now focused on controlling the bank angle. The aircraft is oscillating left and right due to the sensitive controls in alternate law. He makes continuous inputs trying to stabilize it, but while his attention is on roll control, the pitch continues increasing unnoticed. This is how accidents unfold. Not through a single mistake, but through attention being pulled in the wrong direction. Then something unexpected happens. The flight directors reappear on the display. Normally they guide the pilot, but now they are giving incorrect guidance. They command a climb matching the current vertical speed, which is already dangerously high. Instead of helping, they are reinforcing the problem. But why were they not turned off? Because the pilots never fully identified the situation as unreliable airspeed. The relief pilot finally looks up from the warnings and notices the pitch. He calls out to reduce it. The first officer responds, but only slightly. The aircraft continues climbing, still losing speed, still approaching a critical limit. They pass their maximum altitude capability. The engines can no longer sustain the climb. The aircraft begins to lose energy rapidly, but inside the cockpit the focus is still divided. Then, at 02:10:36, something changes again. The speed briefly returns, showing around 220 knots. But by now, it is too late. The aircraft has already lost nearly 50 knots of speed, and it continues to decrease. The first officer makes another unexpected move. He reduces thrust. This further removes energy from the aircraft. Now the situation becomes even more critical. The relief pilot calls for the captain. He presses the call button repeatedly. He asks where he is, but the captain is still in the rest compartment, unaware that the aircraft is seconds away from disaster. And then the stall warning returns. This time it does not stop. It sounds continuously, filling the cockpit with a clear message. The aircraft is stalling, but the reaction is completely opposite of what is needed. Instead of pushing the nose down, the first officer pulls back harder. He increases the pitch to 16 degrees, nose up. This is similar to takeoff attitude, but at this altitude it is fatal. Why would a pilot do that? Because under stress the brain reverts to training. In many scenarios, maximum thrust and nose-up input is the correct response, but only when protections are active. In this case, those protections are gone. The aircraft now reaches the critical angle of attack. Lift collapses. The wings can no longer support the aircraft. Instead of climbing, it begins to fall. But this is not a normal descent. The aircraft is still pitched upward. The nose is above the horizon, yet it is falling rapidly toward the ocean below. This is a fully developed aerodynamic stall. The engines are at maximum thrust, but at this altitude they cannot produce enough power to recover. The thin air provides little lift. The aircraft is now trapped in a state where it cannot climb and cannot accelerate. The relief pilot tries to guide the first officer. He tells him to stabilize and reduce inputs, but the first officer continues making large control movements. The aircraft oscillates further, losing even more stability. The captain still has not returned. The aircraft reaches its maximum altitude, just under 38,000 feet, and then it begins its descent. But inside the cockpit, something even more dangerous is happening. The pilots still do not understand that they are in a stall. They believe they are overspeeding. This single misunderstanding changes everything, because every action they take is now based on the wrong assumption. Instead of lowering the nose to regain speed, they keep pulling back, trying to slow down what they think is an overspeed condition. But in reality, they are pushing the aircraft deeper into stall, and now the aircraft is no longer flying, it is falling. The aircraft is now descending, but the nose is still pointing upward. The engines are at maximum thrust. The stall warning is sounding continuously. Inside the cockpit, confusion has reached its peak. The pilots are no longer reacting to a clear situation. They are reacting to fragments of information that do not make sense together. So what happens when the captain walks back into this? At 02:11:42, the cockpit door opens. The captain returns, after being called back. But what he sees does not match anything he has experienced before. The aircraft is shaking violently. Alarms are sounding. The displays are inconsistent. Neither of the two pilots can clearly explain what is happening. He asks a simple question: "What are you doing?" But there is no clear answer. The relief pilot says he does not understand. The first officer says they are losing control. But neither of them mentions the most critical fact: the aircraft is stalled. This is where the situation becomes even more dangerous. The captain is trying to understand a problem that has already been misunderstood from the beginning. Without that understanding, every decision becomes delayed. At this moment, the aircraft is still falling at a tremendous rate. The vertical speed is exceeding 10,000 feet per minute. The pitch is oscillating between nose up and nose down. The bank angle shifts unpredictably. The stall warning continues to sound. Then suddenly it stops. Why would the stall warning stop in the middle of a stall? Because the system depends on valid speed data. When the calculated speed drops below a certain threshold, the system assumes the aircraft must be on the ground, so it disables the stall warning. This creates a deadly illusion. The warning disappears exactly when the situation is at its worst. Then, as the nose lowers slightly, the speed increases again. The system regains confidence. The stall warning returns. But now it sounds when the nose is going down, and disappears when the nose goes up. This reversal makes the situation even more confusing. Inside the cockpit, the first officer begins to believe something completely different. He believes the aircraft is overspeeding. He says he has the impression that they have speed. This belief drives his actions. Instead of pushing the nose down to recover lift, he continues pulling back. He is trying to slow the aircraft down, but each time he does this, he increases the angle of attack. This pushes the aircraft deeper into stall. The relief pilot tries to intervene. He gives instructions. He asks for corrections, but he never takes full control decisively. Because Airbus side sticks are not physically connected, he cannot feel what the first officer is doing. This lack of feedback creates a dangerous disconnect. The aircraft continues falling through 35,000 feet. Then 30,000. The descent rate increases further. The angle of attack remains extremely high. The wings are no longer producing lift. The aircraft is essentially falling flat through the sky. The captain tries to interpret the instruments. He sees altitude decreasing rapidly. He sees inconsistent speed readings. He hears alarms but cannot determine their cause. Crucially, he has not been told about the initial sequence of events. He does not know about the pitot failure. He does not know about the rapid climb. He does not know about the transition into stall. Without this information, he is forced to guess. The first officer suddenly reduces thrust to idle. This causes the nose to drop slightly. For a brief moment, the aircraft begins to recover some speed, but then the stall warning returns again, loud and continuous. This reinforces the wrong belief. The pilots interpret the warning as something related to overspeed or instability, rather than a stall. So once again, the first officer pulls back. The aircraft returns to a nose-up attitude. The descent continues faster. The speed drops again. The stall warning disappears, and the cycle repeats. Each oscillation takes them lower and closer to the ocean. But inside the cockpit, the confusion only grows. At around 20,000 feet, the aircraft is still descending uncontrollably. The pilots are discussing altitude. They are questioning their instruments. They are trying to stabilize the wings, but none of them are addressing the core problem. The relief pilot attempts to take control. He presses the takeover button. He makes inputs, but the first officer does not release his controls. Both pilots are now giving inputs at the same time. The system responds with a warning. Dual input. This means both side sticks are active. The commands are being averaged. The result is that neither pilot has full control. The aircraft continues falling. The captain tries to guide them. He suggests using rudder to correct the bank. For a brief moment it works, but the underlying problem remains. The aircraft is still stalled. The descent rate now reaches between 10 and 15,000 feet per minute. The aircraft is falling faster than any normal controlled descent. The angle of attack remains extreme, around 40 degrees. The airflow is no longer coming from the front. It is coming from below. This creates a strange sensation inside the cockpit. The wind noise changes. The controls feel ineffective. The aircraft does not respond normally. Yet the pilots still do not recognize the stall. At one point, the first officer pushes the controls forward briefly. The nose drops. The speed increases slightly. Immediately, the stall warning returns. But instead of recognizing this as recovery feedback, he interprets it as danger. He pulls back again. This is the final trap. The system is giving correct warnings, but they are being misinterpreted. The relief pilot again asks for control. He calls out that he has the controls, but the first officer continues to override him. Another dual input warning sounds. Once again, the commands cancel each other out. The captain begins to realize what is happening. He hears the first officer say that he has been pulling up for a long time. This is the moment of realization. The captain reacts immediately. He tells him not to climb. He tells him to go down. But by now, the aircraft is already deep into a fully developed stall at high altitude. The energy state of the aircraft is completely depleted. Even if the correct inputs were applied immediately, recovery would be extremely difficult. The aircraft passes 10,000 feet. The ground proximity warning system activates. It calls out sink rate, pull up. The urgency in the cockpit increases dramatically. Now all three pilots are focused on avoiding impact, rather than solving the aerodynamic problem. This shifts their actions even further away from the correct response. The relief pilot attempts one final time to push the nose down, but the first officer presses his priority button. This locks out the other controls. Now only his inputs are active. He pulls back again in panic. The aircraft pitches up one final time, but there is no lift left to sustain it. Below them, the Atlantic Ocean is rushing closer every second. At 02:14:28, Air France Flight 447 crashes into the Atlantic Ocean. The aircraft impacts the water at a steep angle with extreme vertical speed. The force of the impact destroys the aircraft instantly. All 228 people on board are lost within seconds. There is no distress call. There is no final message. And for a long time, there is no clear explanation of what happened. In the hours that follow, air traffic control begins to notice something unusual. The aircraft has stopped reporting its position. Communication attempts fail. Radar contact had already been lost over the ocean, and the automatic reporting system was never active due to a simple error. This means the aircraft has effectively vanished. The first question becomes, where is it? Search operations begin across a vast area of the Atlantic Ocean. Aircraft scan the surface. Ships move into position. But the ocean reveals very little. Days pass before debris is finally located. This confirms the aircraft has crashed, but it does not explain why. And without survivors or immediate data, the investigation enters a long period of uncertainty. Investigators now face a major challenge. The flight recorders are essential. The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder contain the answers, but they are located deep below the ocean surface, at depths that push the limits of recovery technology. So how do you find something in an environment like this? Initial search efforts fail. The ocean floor is vast and uneven. The wreckage is scattered. Time passes without results. The investigation struggles to move forward. Theories begin to emerge. Some suggest structural failure. Others consider external causes, but none of them can be confirmed without evidence. It takes nearly 2 years before a renewed search effort succeeds. Advanced underwater vehicles locate the wreckage. The flight recorders are finally recovered, and for the first time, investigators can reconstruct the final moments of the flight. The data reveals something critical. The aircraft itself was functioning normally until the pitot probes became blocked by ice crystals. This caused inconsistent airspeed readings, which triggered the autopilot to disconnect. But that was only the beginning of the chain of events. When the airspeed data became unreliable, the aircraft systems responded as designed. Automation disengaged. Protections were removed. The aircraft entered alternate law. This left full control to the pilots. But here is the key question. Why did a manageable situation turn into a catastrophe? The cockpit recordings provide the answer. The pilots did not recognize the situation as unreliable airspeed. They did not apply the correct procedure. Instead, they reacted to the faulty indications they were seeing. This led to the initial pitch-up input, which started the chain reaction. At high altitude, this action rapidly reduced airspeed. The aircraft climbed beyond its performance capability, and within seconds it entered a stall. But the stall was never clearly identified by the crew. Investigators now focus on why the stall was not recognized. The answer lies in training and human factors. The pilots had not received recent training on high-altitude stall recovery. Their previous experience emphasized adding thrust and maintaining pitch in certain emergency situations. In normal law, the aircraft would prevent a stall even with aggressive inputs. But in alternate law, those protections were no longer active. Under stress, the first officer reverted to familiar actions. He applied maximum thrust and continued pulling back, expecting the aircraft to protect itself, but it did not. Another critical factor was the design of the stall warning system. The warning depended on valid airspeed data. When the speed dropped below a certain threshold, the warning stopped, even though the aircraft was still stalled. When speed increased slightly, the warning returned. This created a confusing pattern. This behavior led the pilots to misinterpret the warnings. They believed they were dealing with overspeed or unstable flight conditions, not a stall, and this misunderstanding drove every incorrect action that followed. Crew coordination also played a major role. The relief pilot attempted to assist, but did not take decisive control. The captain returned too late and was not fully briefed. There was no clear shared understanding of the situation, and without that shared understanding, effective action was impossible. The cockpit environment added further difficulty. Multiple warnings sounded at the same time. Alerts competed for attention. The pilots were overwhelmed by information. And under this pressure, their ability to diagnose the problem was severely reduced. The investigation concludes that the primary cause of the accident was the failure of the flight crew to recognize and respond correctly to the loss of airspeed information. This led to a prolonged stall from which the aircraft never recovered. But the investigation also identifies several contributing factors. These include the vulnerability of pitot probes to ice crystals, the lack of high-altitude stall training, the confusing logic of the stall warning system, and the breakdown in crew communication. Each of these factors alone might not have caused a crash, but together they created a situation that the crew could not resolve in time. In response to this accident, major changes were implemented across the aviation industry. Pilot training programs were updated to include high-altitude stall recovery. Procedures for unreliable airspeed were reinforced. Aircraft systems were improved to provide clearer warnings, and pitot probes were redesigned to reduce the risk of blockage. This accident became a turning point. It highlighted the limits of automation and the importance of fundamental flying skills, because even the most advanced aircraft depends on the human ability to understand what is happening. Today, the lessons of this flight continue to influence aviation safety. Every pilot trained after this accident carries knowledge that was written through its investigation. And the final question remains: how does a modern aircraft with experienced pilots fall from the sky without a clear mechanical failure? The answer is not a single mistake. It is a chain of events. A chain that begins with something small and ends with something irreversible. If you enjoy real aviation investigations, detailed crash analysis, and the untold stories behind the world's biggest air disasters, make sure to subscribe, because the next flight we investigate might completely change the way you look at aviation.